Alrighty, hey guys, it's just me again. So we will do the live stream and go through this. And if someone else comes in, that's fine, and if not, oh well. Again, if you have questions about what I've talked about, or you want me to clarify something or anything like that, feel free to send me an email. You can go to my website, brianediger.com, and go to the Contact Us page. There's also a link on there to the YouTube channel, which you're already on, and also the Facebook group if you'd like to join. And feel free to ask questions there. Just don't be rude. Obviously, I will kick you if you get out of line. So, from there, this week we're going to talk about First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. That may sound like a lot of text to you guys, and if we were reading through it all, it would be. Basically, though, as we'll see in the introductions, there's a lot of the same instances and events that are being talked about in these books, and we're really going to focus in on just a few of the main stories in these books. And basically, as you can see here on the title page, it goes from the prophet Samuel, who is also the last judge, on through to the Babylonian captivity. So, introduction. Now, 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Hebrew was originally one book. Um, I'd have to look at a Jewish Tanakh today to see if there's still one book. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, especially since it's a lot cheaper now to write and print things. Back then, you had to either write on parchment or vellum, which is animal skin. Um, Parchment was made from various papery, planty materials, if I remember correctly. Papyrus is definitely a plant material because it's made from papyrus. So if I'm wrong about the parchment, forgive me, it may be an animal product as well. But when the Greeks translated the Old Testament, or not the Greeks, when the Hellenized Jews, that is the Jews who were sort of becoming Greekish, um, when they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, they had to separate it onto two separate scrolls. And that's because Hebrew in the original only had consonant letters. There were a few letters that acted as vowel letters. Um, I won't get too much into languages, but basically they had fewer letters than the Greeks did. And the Greeks, they had vowels, and so their words were longer. I guess I shouldn't say they had fewer letters, because really the Hebrew alphabet is 22 letters long. The Greek one, I think, is comparable to ours at about 26, I think maybe 24, give or take. But the words themselves were shorter. And of course, there's always the prefixes and suffixes and all this stuff in Hebrew that tells you what exactly a word is saying. And again, I don't want to get too much into that. But basically, when they translated it into Greek, the text became so much longer that they needed multiple scrolls. So that's where the books got divided up, and it's kind of arbitrary as to where they divided it. If you look at some of the other manuscripts, at least from what I've been able to deduce from my studies, not from anything I've actually looked at. Anyway, it's thought to have been completed around 960 BC. The events in 1st Samuel, as we have it today, ended about 1000 BC, and they started about 1100 BC. And then 2nd Samuel goes about 40 more years from there. And so the earliest it could have been completed was about 960 BC, maybe a little bit later. The authors were not certain about. Samuel certainly could have written part of it. There's also the idea that Nathan and Gad wrote it, which comes, I believe, from First Chronicles. I forget the reference. But if you go to .questions.org and you look up the book of First Samuel, it'll give you an introduction and various other things that'll be good, and then it'll give you the reference that I'm missing there. Now, Samuel, as I said earlier, he was the last judge of Israel, and for the other judges, you can, of course, go to the book of Judges and read about that. We talked a little bit about them last time, not a whole lot, but And from there, towards the end of Samuel's life, Israel is crying out for a king. They want to be like all the other nations. They don't want to have anything to do with judges anymore. They want a line of succession to judge them. They want a king. And God grants their request. Again, he tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, which is the same thing he told Moses. That seems to be something that God tells his chosen leaders fairly often, at least in this early portion. Um, I'm not, sorry about that. I'm not sure if he told Joshua that ever. I know he told Moses that, and I know he told Samuel that. So maybe my statement of often is a little off. Um, but with the study we've done lately, it's been a bit of a recurring theme so far, anyway. Anywho, so God, in a rather interesting way, uh, points out Saul to Samuel. It has to do with Saul losing some donkeys that belonged to his dad, and he goes and looks for them with a servant, and that's where they run into Samuel, and um, they ask him. They don't know he's a seer. They don't know him personally, so they ask him where the seer's house is, and he says, "Well, I'm the seer. Come with me." And then there's a lot of other stuff that goes on. Samuel does tell him, "Don't worry about the donkeys. They've gone home already. They've been found." And he basically tells Saul um, that he's going to be the king, and we'll be going over that a little bit more later in this study. Then we have David showing up, not as king yet, not even being anointed yet necessarily, or he may have been, but Saul does know about David, and they interact, and Saul actually seeks to kill David because David is going to become king. Um, but David does respect Saul since he is still the rightful king until he dies. Then Saul finally dies, and David takes over, and um, from there, the second book of Samuel kind of takes over. And of course, David's reign isn't without its problems, as we'll see. Now, for Kings, again, it was originally one book. Same thing when they translated it into Greek, it became much longer. They needed two scrolls. It's thought to have been written between 560 and 540 BC, which is during the Babylonian captivity, kind of towards the end. And the author traditionally is the prophet Jeremiah. You may find some other sources that give some others. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think it was Jeremiah. Sounds good to me. It starts with King Solomon becoming king, and that was David's son, one of David's sons. Um, Not the one who typically would have been king. Normally that's a firstborn kind of a thing, but Bathsheba, who is Solomon's mother, she kind of got David to give him the kingship. She had his ear pretty well, more than the other wives did. So Solomon starts off pretty well. He asks for wisdom because God grants him anything he wants, and God said, "Well, since you asked for wisdom to lead my people and not a long life or riches, I'm going to give you everything pretty much," and he does. But then he starts to fall into similar temptations to David. David had a weakness for women, and so does Solomon. And there's an inordinate amount of wives and concubines. After Solomon, the kingdom of Israel splits into two. Now, the northern kingdom, which is 10 tribes, they're called the Israelites, and the southern kingdom is called Judah, and they're the other two tribes. And Kings kind of goes back and forth describing these kings, those who follow Yahweh and those who don't. Of course, none of the northern kingdom kings follow Yahweh, even though they have prophets coming to them, which we'll learn about next time a little bit. Then we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it again was originally one book. It's thought to have been completed between 450 and 425 BC. This was after the Babylonian captivity. Traditionally, the author is Ezra, who was a prophet, a priest, and a scribe. So he wore many hats. Notice, however, while you can be a prophet and a priest and a scribe, you cannot be a priest and a king. Possibly a prophet and a king. Matter of fact, I think that David and Solomon in ways were prophets to varying degrees. David wrote some prophetic psalms about the Messiah, and then also, being a prophet doesn't necessarily mean that you will say this is going to happen in the future, but it's more of if you don't come back to God, things are going to be bad for you, which isn't really prophesying. It's not in the sense that we know it as foretelling the future, but it's rather saying, these are the consequences that logically come from what you're doing. The work of Chronicles covers both Samuel and Kings. It doesn't focus on the exact same things or even the exact same details, but it does give a lot of the same accounts, and it's more of a priestly focus, which makes sense since Ezra was a priest. It also focuses on the southern kingdom of Judah and not really the northern kingdom of Israel. And the purpose of it was really to help the returning Jews, those coming back from Babylon and rebuilding the city, to help them with their daily lives and worshiping Yahweh. And because really, if they still had those books, which I believe they did, if they still had the books of Moses and even Joshua, and possibly Judges and Ruth, which I believe they had at least the books of Moses. Um, it would have been written in a much older language. Like, I mean, if you were to pick up a copy of Beowulf that's written in the original language it was written in, which was English, but it's like Old English, you and I wouldn't be able to read that unless you happen to know Old English, of course. Um, and even the King James from 1,000 years ago is very different. Well, King James wasn't around 1,000 years ago. Um, well, yeah, it was. Yeah, 1611, so 1,400 years ago. But even the King James from just 1,000 years ago is very different from the King James now. So there's no doubt in my mind that Ezra and others um, who would have known the older language because they were priests, they would have been translating it into the modern Hebrew, or the contemporary of them anyway, Hebrew, not modern Hebrew as we know it, obviously. So from there, let's start. Really, it all starts with uh, Samuel's mother, Hannah, praying for a child. I forget exactly what was going on, but she was barren and she did want a child. And of course, every father wants a child, um, and specifically a boy. And she prayed for a boy, and she promised to make him a Nazarite, which there's a whole Nazarite vow of not cutting the hair and not drinking wine, and various other aspects of that. Um, Samson was also a Nazarite, although I don't think that he really kept his vows that well. At least not as far as the hair cutting, since he told Delilah about that and she cut the hair. But anyway, so she makes that devotion, saying, if you give me a son, I will do this. And I don't think she was as happy as she looks in that picture, because Eli, who was the priest at that time, he thought that she was drunk. Of course, it was fairly early in the morning, if I remember correctly, so her being drunk was not going to be an issue. And he really changed his tune once he found out what she was praying for, and the vow that she had made as well. So she conceives and has Samuel. And when he is old enough to leave his mother, when he's weaned, she keeps her promise. She takes him to Eli, and Samuel goes into service under Eli and learns all the priestly stuff and how to be a priest. And then one night, when Eli is in bed and his eyesight's pretty bad, as the text tells us, Samuel is in his bedroom, and he hears a voice calling his name, Samuel. Now, it's Yahweh, but he doesn't know it's Yahweh. He hasn't heard Yahweh's voice yet before this. And so he runs to Eli and says, I'm here, you called me. And Eli says, no, I didn't call you. And go back to bed. And a couple more times this happens. And Eli finally realizes, I don't know if it's because he was older or maybe it was late or what, but he finally realizes that the boy is hearing the voice of Yahweh. And so he tells him, go back to bed, and when you hear the voice again, say, speak Yahweh, for your servant is listening. And so Samuel goes back and he hears his name again, Samuel, and he says what Eli told him to say. And from there, God tells Samuel what he is about to do, which is the fulfilling of a prophecy that was made a little bit earlier in Samuel to Eli, because Eli's sons were wicked priests, wicked men. They were greedy. The specific thing that was mentioned about them, which I'm sure is just one of many things, was their choosing of what part of the sacrifice was to be theirs, because what was supposed to happen with certain sacrifices is after skinning the animal and cleaning it, they were to start, butcher it up and then start boiling it. And then the priest would take a three-pronged tong and jab it into the boiling water and pull it out, and whatever was on the end of the tong, that was theirs. But Eli's sons, they had a servant who they told to tell the people that were sacrificing, you know, give the priests this portion of meat and give it to them raw. Um, and if the person making the sacrifice said, well, at least burn the fat off, they'd say no, give it to them raw. Um, and then I would assume, and then I believe it says actually that they would roast that meat they got. So obviously they were cooking it to what they wanted it to be, and they were choosing probably the finest cuts instead of doing what God told them to do, which, granted, boiled meat isn't as good as roasted, but I think that, who knows what portion God would have given them. It may have been the best, it may have been the worst, but um, anyway, for this and for other offenses that his sons were doing, God tells Eli that his family is no longer going to walk before him. That is, they're no longer going to serve him. Eli was a descendant of Aaron, and it was Aaron's line that was going to keep the priesthood. Now, obviously, there wasn't just one line of Aaron. There were multiple sons born to multiple sons of Aaron and whatnot. But so Eli's family would not be a priest any longer, and this is what he says in 1 Samuel 2:30. Therefore, Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, although I said your family and your ancestral house would walk before me forever, Yahweh now says no longer. I will honor those who honor me, but those who despise me will be disgraced. So I think with this, it's not that God isn't keeping his promises, because God's promises, well, yeah, God's promises always have some sort of condition. Now, in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, we see examples of this where God says, if you follow my commands, I will bless you, and if you disobey them, I will curse you. And to be honest, it's not even necessarily that God is making you do things you don't want to do. Matter of fact, he doesn't do that. It's not that God is purposely making situations bad. Maybe he causes a famine, stuff like that. But also, he can just take his hand of blessing off and let things run the way they're going to run, and that in itself is enough for any country to run itself into the ground, which, to be honest, I think is happening here in America, but we shall see. But so it's not God renouncing his promise. It's that he gave conditions. If you do this, I will bless you. If you don't do this, I will curse you. And it's very similar with the new covenant as well. It's if you don't believe in my son Jesus Christ and follow him, then you will end up in hell. You'll end up separated from God, which is what hell is. It's a separation. And if you do, then you'll end up in heaven. Now, of course, again, there's nothing we can do ourselves other than choosing that in order to get into heaven. But it's still conditional. And so I guess I don't want to get into a whole long discussion about whether or not you can lose your salvation just now. I will write a blog on that and maybe do a video of some of the blogs also. So we'll see about that. So God told Samuel he was going to fulfill this promise, this pronouncement, and then after he does fulfill it, and after Samuel's old enough, he takes over as judge and priest of Israel. I'm not sure how long that took, but I don't think that he took over as judge as a little boy, which he was still a little boy. um, at the time, I believe, that he heard God calling him for the first time. And so he has a fairly decent um, time as judge. He has some sons as well. They also are wicked, and the people don't like them, which is one of the reasons why they called for a king, although I don't know why they think a king would um, necessarily fix the problem of people being wicked, but they did. Now, Samuel knew that this wasn't the will of God, and he thought it was sinful, but God said, no, let them have a king. They're rejecting me, not you, and, it's okay. And so he points out Saul, as I had mentioned earlier with the donkeys and whatnot. I think when he actually anoints Saul, though, Saul initially is hiding, and of course, Saul was, well, let's look at this, shall we? As you can see in the picture here, there's one person who is rather tall, and he kind of stands out. Saul is described as being a head taller than everyone else. Now, that's not necessarily why he was chosen. It's part of it, I'm sure. Um, I think God did this actually because he's going to show Israel that outward appearance is not the way to choose a king. Because Saul, he was tall, he was strong. Uh, I think he was described even as being handsome. I'll have to look into that again. Um, his father was respected. He was humble to begin with because he did say, I come from the smallest clan in the tribe of Benjamin, and I'm going to be king, you know. And at first he wasn't really certain that he wanted to be king, but God kind of worked in him to change his mind, and Saul even ended up prophesying with the school of prophets there, um, which is interesting that there wasn't just one prophet, there was a school of prophets. Um, and I would think that if prophets were still a thing, there'd still be a school. Um, but I don't think that anyone right now could be considered a true prophet. Um, a lot of good people out there that call people to God, definitely. But again, I guess that kind of depends on your definition of prophet as well. So, and as I said, at first he did pretty well. Now he did do a lot of things as far as conquering or fighting back at least the neighbors of Israel that were trying to conquer them. But he also did some foolish things. One thing in particular, which this picture is depicting, is that he was waiting for Samuel to come. He had an appointed time, or at least within these number of days, and Samuel didn't come. I don't know if it's because Samuel was just getting up there in age and taking longer, or maybe he was doing something. But he um, he didn't make it on time, and so Saul kind of got in a panic, and he decided to make the sacrifice himself, which he wasn't a priest, so he shouldn't have done that. But he thought that Yahweh would be on his side if he sacrificed, not realizing that it was um, proper obedience that leads to Yahweh's favor, not just blind obedience. And so Samuel shows up at kind of, after Saul has already done it, and he gets angry at Saul and says, God gives him the words to say that uh, Saul's son will not rule, but someone else will after him, which we will see who that is in a bit. Of course, Saul continues to do some rather rash things, and he proves to be a bad king. God does um, end up sending a spirit to Saul, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. It's not a good spirit, I'll tell you that much. And God ends up appointing another king, but Saul still reigns until his death. Now, that other king is David. Now, David had 7 older brothers, and when God sent Samuel to anoint the new king, he just told him to go to the house of Jesse, and so he did. A little bit of back and forth about how Saul would kill him if he found out that he was going to do this, but just take some oxen and say you're going to do a sacrifice. So he goes to the house of Jesse, and he tells Jesse that God has chosen one of his sons to be king, and he wants to meet them. And so he meets them, starting with the oldest and then going on down. Now, um, God tells Samuel not to notice some of the boys. And I'll read 1 Samuel 16:7. It says, "But Yahweh said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have rejected him. Man does not see what Yahweh sees, for man sees what is visible, but Yahweh sees the heart." And this was after saying just the first son of Jesse. So whatever the first son of Jesse was, let me see if I can find his name real quick. Eliab, Eliab. Eliab apparently didn't have the right heart for the job. He may have been very good at the things he did, but he wasn't right for God's people. And as we go through the other 7 brothers, God rejects them. I don't think it talks about all of them, but it does say that God rejected them all. And then Samuel says, well, none of these are it. Do you have another son? And he says, well, just the youngest out tending the sheep. And he says, well, we'll bring him. And so they bring him in, and Samuel says, this is the one, and he anoints David. And David was the youngest, and so I'm sure all the other brothers were jealous and whatnot. And of course, David was nothing more than a shepherd boy, but he was a very good shepherd. He protected his sheep from the bears and the wolves, and it's something he mentions when he goes up against Goliath a little bit later. Now, I talked about the spirit that God sent upon Saul, and it was an evil spirit that tormented him. But music would actually soothe it, and he knew that, or at least he heard, that David could play the lyre really well. And so he got David into his court, and David played the lyre, and it soothed Saul, and the spirit would leave, at least for a time. Sure, it would come back as well. And of course, there's a lot more to the story. I do encourage you to read these parts. A little later on, we get to a story that practically everybody knows, David and Goliath. Even if you don't know the story, you at least know that there was a giant and a little boy, and the little boy took down the giant. I'm not sure how old David was. He may not have been a boy per se, maybe in his late teens, early 20s. Basically, Goliath was a Philistine, and the Philistines did not like the Jews. They were always fighting with each other. And of course, Saul didn't help with all of his wars against them. And it's said that Goliath was a giant, as I said. If you look at the text, I believe it says 6.5 cubits or 9 feet 9 inches tall, depending on which translation you're using. Trying to think. 6 cubits would be 9 foot, because a cubit is about 1.5 feet, depending on which cubit you use. I typically use an 18-inch cubit. It's on the smaller scale, and so if he's bigger, he's bigger. Then the half a cubit would be 6 inches, so 9 inches, yeah, so 9 foot 9 inches tall. I've seen some other translations give a few inches difference, a few shorter even, so maybe they didn't use the right cubit or weren't calculating correctly. Anyways, he would actually taunt the Israelite army. Like he would walk out a little ways in front of the Philistine army, and he'd say, "Give me a challenger. Let's do one-on-one combat. And if you win, we'll serve you. And if I win, you'll serve us." And of course, he said some rather mean things about Yahweh and about Israel and whatnot. Well, David is sent up by his father to give his brothers some bread and cheese and whatnot, because he's not fighting in the army, he's taking care of the sheep, but they're fighting in the army. Well, David goes up and he hears this, and he doesn't accept this. You know, who's this Philistine to be talking about our God that way, about us? And so he says he's going to take on Goliath, and at first Saul gives David his armor, but David kind of walks around, and it's big, it's clunky, it doesn't fit him. You know, it was tailored for Saul, and Saul was much bigger than David. Even if David was full grown, he was probably, smaller than Saul was, because Saul was a head taller than everyone else. except for Goliath, of course, obviously. But so David takes that off and he says, "No, I've got God with me, and that's enough." And he walks over, he picks up 5 stones from the riverbed, and some people make a big deal about that, that he was going to not only go after Goliath, but also Goliath's 4 brothers. Um, I don't know, maybe he just wanted to make sure because he knows he's a good shot, but he might need more than one. He's had a lot of practice with shooing off the bears and the wolves from his sheep. So, and of course, Goliath is like, well, who's this puny pipsqueak? And him and his shield bearer go out, and Goliath, he has his spear and I think he has a sword, and of course he has a shield with the shield bearer, and he has armor, he has bronze, the text says greaves on his legs, so greaves are normally up here on the arm, but he's got these on his legs, so he's dressed to the nines in armor, basically, at least for back then. David just takes his stone and his sling and he starts swirling it around over his head like you can see in the picture, and then he lets it fly, and those slingshots and those stones, when you get good with them, they can really throw the rock pretty far, and it hit Goliath in the forehead. Um, I saw an article about how it may have been his shin because the word for greaves looks like a plural form of the word for forehead. I looked at the Hebrew, I don't see the connection. Yeah, there's a few letters that are the same, but I still don't see the connection. I think it hit him in the forehead, and I don't think it was hard enough to knock him backwards, but it was hard enough to make him, you know, dizzy or whatever, and then he falls forward because the text does say he fell on his face. After he falls on his face, David runs over, pulls out Goliath's sword. So yes, Goliath did have a sword, and he cuts off Goliath's head, and then takes it back to Saul. And the Philistine army runs away. I think the Israelite army runs after them, you know, and so David becomes a part of Saul's army and eventually becomes a general. I don't know if it's right away or a little ways afterwards, after he learns strategy and whatnot. Maybe that makes sense. So, what can we learn from Saul and David? Definitely don't be like Saul. Don't think that God cares more about the ritual than he does proper loving obedience. Um, as I said, Saul thought it was a sacrifice, but really it's the proper way of doing the sacrifice that matters. In another place in the Minor Prophets, God says that he doesn't desire sacrifices, he desires obedience, which from a Christian perspective, I think harkens to Romans 6:1, where Saul says, "What therefore shall we say? Shall we keep on sinning that grace may abound? By no means, we are dead to sin." And I think that it's kind of two sides of the same coin. Um, we can't just do whatever we want to do and then pray and ask forgiveness and repent. We have to truly repent, which is turning from our sins and not doing them. Again, we can't do it perfectly, or we're going to slip and fall, but we can't have the mindset of, oh, well, God will forgive me, so I can go ahead and do it. That's not the way things work. Then we need to be like David, who knew that God was with him and that everything was going to be okay. That he could slay the giant. And David wasn't going to let anybody talk bad about God or his people, which I think is something else that we as Christians need to do. When we hear somebody bad-mouthing Christians, we need to talk to them about it and be loving and gentle about it. We don't need to go and slay the giant, at least not physically, metaphorically possibly. But see why they're saying what they're saying, try and get an understanding of that, and then tell them, I see you had this bad experience with these Christians, but not all Christians are like that, and it's quite possible that they don't, even have the same beliefs that I do, but we'll leave that aside for now. And as a Christian, I do this and I do that, and this is how I think things should be done, and try and then show them that if you have a chance, if you're around them often, you can show them how Christians live instead of just telling them how Christians live. To use an old saying, and I'm dating myself, um, you need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Of course, there are many other stories about David's life, things that we don't necessarily want to repeat. Now, David, he had many military victories, and there were some incidences where he was bringing back the Ark of the Covenant, and he was dancing so much, and at least one of his wives, I don't know if she was the only one at that point or not, but she got angry at him because he was, just he wasn't fully dressed when he was dancing. I'm sure he had enough on, but he wasn't fully dressed, and he was flaunting himself. She wasn't happy about that. Of course, while Saul is still alive, Saul thought that David was going to try and take over before he died, but David didn't have any intention of doing that. He still respected Saul as God's anointed, even though God had taken the kingdom from him and given it to David. Um, you know, and actually some pretty good stories there where David and his men are in a cave hiding, and Saul and his men are looking around for him. Saul goes into the cave that David's in, not knowing he's there, and he relieves himself, call of nature there. David actually sneaks up and cuts off the corner of Saul's robe, and then gets back into hiding, and then Saul leaves, and after a while, David walks out pretty quick because Saul hadn't left Saul hadn't left with his men yet, and David says, "Hey, look, I cut off the corner of your robe. I could have killed you, but I didn't. So why don't you leave me alone?" Basically, is what he says. Then we have the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. I think most people know about Bathsheba, how David looked from his palace, and his balcony was up high. Maybe he was even on his roof. I don't know. But he looked down on Bathsheba's roof, and she was bathing on the roof. Why she was bathing on the roof, I have no idea, but she was. And he decides that he wants to sleep with her. So he gets her into his palace, and they sleep together, and of course, she becomes pregnant. Now, to try and hide this, David calls Uriah, her husband, back from battle, because the army is currently at battle. David didn't go with him this time because he's king now. And I guess it was just one of those that he didn't feel like he needed to be at. Now, Uriah is also a good friend of David, which makes this even sadder, really. David tries to get Uriah to go home and sleep with Bathsheba, not outrightly saying it, saying, "Oh, you've done a great job, you deserve to go home and be with your wife," that kind of a thing. But Uriah's like, "No, my brothers are still out there fighting, and I wouldn't feel right being comfortable and sleeping with my wife when they're out there like that." So he goes to the barracks and sleeps, or maybe even outside. I think it was at the barracks, though. And so David is a little miffed about this, and he wants to hide this child. He wants Uriah to think that it's his. Then Uriah goes back to battle. Before he does, David gives him a note to give to I forget the name of the general, but you can look it up. I would, but it would take too long right now. But he gives Uriah a note to give to the general, and of course Uriah isn't supposed to look at it because it's for the general, and he doesn't. He gives it to the general, and it tells the general to put Uriah in the heat of battle where it's the worst possible fighting, where it's most likely that he will die. I don't think the note said that, where it's most likely he will die, but it does say to put him in the heat of the battle. And so Uriah goes into the heat of the battle, and he gets killed. So David knew that was probably more than likely going to happen, and I'm sure Uriah, once he heard he was going to the heat of battle, he knew that he was going to die, because most men in that part of the battle were dying. So after that, David does end up marrying Bathsheba. I'm sure she had a grief period and all that, but then David does end up marrying her. Now God sends Nathan to David. Nathan is a prophet, and he's a guy who's not afraid to send up to the king. And he tells David a story about a rich man who had a big flock. And he was going to throw this party with some friends, but he didn't want to use any of his own flock, so he went and he got the single lamb of his poor neighbor, the only lamb the guy had. And he takes it and he cooks it and he has it with his friends. And he says, what should be done to this rich man? And David says, well, he should be punished. I think he says he should be killed. I'll have to look into that. And then Nathan says, well, guess what? You're the rich man, and Uriah was your poor neighbor. I don't know if he mentioned Uriah's name or not, but David gets the point, and he's heartbroken. He repents. Unfortunately, the baby that they have is taken ill. It's a punishment from God. Nothing against the child. But it's God saying, there are consequences to what you do. And so their first baby dies. And the repenting that David does over and over again, by the way, is why David is a man after God's own heart. Saul didn't repent. Many of the other kings later on didn't repent. Some did, many didn't. From there, David and Bathsheba do have another son, and Bathsheba is not David's only wife, by the way. The kingdom was going to go to, I forget the names. I should have looked it up. I'm sorry about that. But it was going to go to another son of David. And Solomon's mother convinces David to give it to Solomon instead. And so he does. Now, Solomon, God asked Solomon what he wanted. He could have said a long life, he could have said riches, he could have said anything. But he says, I want wisdom to rule your people well. And God is happy with this, and he grants the request, and he also gives him many riches and a long life. And Solomon is so wise that even the Queen of Sheba comes to see just how great his wisdom is. We're not really sure who she is, where she came from. That's something I would really like to look more into and maybe figure out if I can, but ultimately I don't think it's too important either. It would help with the historicity of the Bible, obviously. Confirming any fact helps. So, which we do have an inscription that does say the house of David, so we do know that David was a real king. I think we might have something for Solomon, but I'm not sure. And then, of course, there's other nations that talk about the kingdom of Israel. Of course, they use slightly different names for the kings and whatnot. But anyway, that's another matter for right now. One of the stories that, in a weird way, I actually kind of like is the story where these two women are fighting over the child. They both had a child. One of their children dies, and it's a baby, it's an infant. And the mother of the child who died tries to switch it out with the one that's alive. But the mother of the one that's alive realizes what's happened, and so they're disputing over it. Now, Solomon, in his wisdom, says, well, how about this? We'll just cut that baby in half and give you each a half. Now, he wasn't really going to do that because he knew that what happened was going to happen. The mother, the true mother of the child, said, no, she can have it, don't kill him. Whereas the other one was like, okay, whatever. And Solomon said, her, the one that said don't kill him, she's the real mother, give the baby to her. I think he threw her in jail or something. I'd have to look at that again, but he at least told her off. So, now Solomon is known for his temple, the first big temple. Up until this point, the Ark of the Covenant had been a tabernacle. The temple does have similar features to the tabernacle. It's laid out the same way. It's just obviously bigger and made of stone and wood and gold and whatnot. Now, David made the preparations for it. He wanted to build it himself, but God said, no, your hands are covered in blood. I don't want you to build my earthly home, where my presence will dwell. But he is allowed to make the preparations and get a bunch of the gold and the silver and the wood and work out things with Lebanon, because Lebanon is known for its cedars and its carpenters and whatnot. And so Solomon builds the house of God, and I believe he spent 7 years building it. Of course, after that, he spends 13 years building the palace, his own palace, a bigger palace than his father had. Also, throughout his reign, he marries many, many, many women from many countries. Um, Part of that was peace treaties and whatnot, I'm sure. He had 700 some odd wives and 300 some odd concubines. I don't know how he could do that. I mean, obviously he had a harem, so he wasn't, with all the women all the time. And most of the women, I'm sure he was only with once or twice or whatever. But still, that's a lot of women. And the main ones, at least, if not all of them, they've got other gods that they worship. The Egyptian princess that he married had the Egyptian gods, and I think there was even a Moabite wife and several other wives that had several other gods. And to keep them happy, he built places of worship around the countryside for them to worship, and he would go with them and worship. And of course, God doesn't like that. The second commandment, thou shalt, or no, yeah, the first and second. Yahweh is God, serve Him, don't have any gods before Him, and then also the third, don't have graven images, which all the other gods had graven images that they would, that the people would worship at. There were a lot of carvings in the temple, as you can see in that picture. I'm not positive if the cherubs look like that or not in the background, because there were the cherubs that were over the Ark of the Covenant, and there is a description of cherubs um, later in the Bible, a few different places in the Bible, and they're described kind of as animal-like, not the little plump babies that we think of today in America by any stretch of the imagination. But these images weren't what they were worshiping. They weren't worshiping at them or anything. They did sprinkle blood on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant and whatnot, but they weren't worshiping the Ark. They were worshiping God. So, but you can see all the details there. I know you can't really read the writing on it, but that wasn't the important part for me. If you Google Solomon's Temple, you can find this picture, and then you can zoom in on those if you want to read them. Now, after Solomon dies, there's a split in the kingdom, and it happens because Solomon's son Rehoboam, he wants to tax the people more. So he's having some issues with the people. Solomon did tax the people pretty heavily towards the end of his reign, and the people are asking for lighter taxes. Now, there's two sets of advisors, some older ones that were his father's advisors, and some younger ones that are pretty much the friends of Rehoboam who want to be advisors. And the older advisors say, you should slacken a little bit and, show them that you're more merciful and whatnot than your father was. But his friends are like, no, you need to, get them under your thumb and tax them even more. And of course, he goes with the young guys who don't know a thing, and that's when the split happens. Jeroboam, who he was one of Solomon's servants, I don't think that was his general's name, but I do think he knew David and worked for David too. I do believe he was also one of Solomon's generals, and he moves to a city up in the northern area, and he talks to the people, and 10 of the tribes go and follow him. The other 2 stay with Rehoboam down in the south there, and that's where the split happens. So, looks like he had several capital cities up north there, if I'm reading the map right. Anyway, that's what happens there, and that's where we get into the good kings and bad kings. And like I said earlier, the kings of the north, and in Israel, they didn't follow Yahweh at all, even though they had prophets that went up and talked to them. I believe Ahaz and Jezebel are the worst of the worst, and they had to deal with the prophet Elijah, who is he's one of my favorite prophets. There's a story of him going up against the prophets of Baal, He asked for the prophets of Asherah as well, but after he asks for them, it just talks about the prophets of Baal or Baal. I say Baal because that's the Hebrew. Um, and he says, well, let's build 2 altars and get 2 bulls to sacrifice, and we won't light the altar though. You call for your God, and if he lights the fire, then he is God. We'll worship him, and then I'll call for Yahweh, and if he lights it, then he is God. We'll worship him. And he lets the prophets and priests of Baal go first, and they're dancing and screaming and like all day long. And eventually they start cutting themselves, and Elijah kind of eggs them on a little bit, which I think it's kind of funny, but I'm not sure that it's a tactic that works very well. Um, Although I guess he was going up against people that should have known better. But anyway, after they're done, he rebuilds an altar that was already there for Yahweh. And he puts his bull on it, he cuts it up and whatnot, and puts 12 stones around it for the 12 tribes. And there are these water jugs nearby, and there's a water source nearby as well. And he tells people, I think there were 4 jugs, rather large jugs. How many gallons, I forget. But he tells them to fill them up and pour them over, and he does that 3 times. So 12 of those jugs worth, which I think it was at least a few gallons in each jug. Um, and so the altar is soaked, and he had dug a trench around it as well, and that was full of water. Not good conditions for lighting a fire, right? And excuse me, he goes up and he prays loudly so that people can hear him. And it's not like the scribes and the priests in Jesus' time who were praying loudly because they wanted to be heard about all the great things that they were saying. That Elijah wanted the people to know who he was praying to, and he basically just says, Yahweh, I speak so that they can hear me. I'm a servant of you, and you are the one true God. Um, and basically, please light the altar. That's a major paraphrase. I would really suggest reading the story. And after he says his prayer, this ball of fire comes down and it burns up the ox, it burns up the wood, the water evaporates, even the stones get burnt. That's how hot this fire was. And I'm surprised it didn't say anything about people dying. But then Elijah tells the people, Yahweh's God, you need to kill the prophets. And they go and they kill the prophets. Of course, Ahaz and Jezebel don't like that, especially not Jezebel. She's a wicked, wicked woman. And so, they do go after Elijah and they end up fighting. So, anyway, that's one of my favorite stories. It is there in Kings. I forget where, but it is there in Kings. I think 2 Kings. So now Judah, the kings of Judah do a little bit better. They kind of go back and forth on this king didn't follow Yahweh, this king did. And when the king that did follow Yahweh came in, he destroyed the temples of the other gods, destroyed their idols, tore down the Asherah poles and everything else. Some did a better job than others, but they still followed Yahweh and they learned his statutes and commandments. So what can we learn from Solomon and the kings after him? Basically, we need to love Yahweh, our God, with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. The greatest commandment, as our Lord and Savior said. Solomon, he allowed the people in his life, especially his wives, to pull him away from God. And the kings that did not follow Yahweh basically did the same. The people and then their own desires were pulling them away from Yahweh. And so, and the ones that did follow Yahweh, they were pretty radical in their following. They destroyed idols and temples and everything else related to false gods. They also killed priests and prophets. I'm not saying we should do that, but we should protect ourselves. So if you are a former anything non-Christian, former atheist, former Mormon, former Buddhist, former whatever, if there are things that are holding you back from serving God, I would look into getting rid of those. Now, some of the things you may want to hang on to. Like if you're a former Muslim, you may want to hold on to your Quran so that you can use it to preach to um, your family and friends that are still Muslims and try and bring them into Christ as well, which I know is going to be a difficult thing. Same if you're a former Mormon, you might want to hold on to your Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants full of great price. Um, but only if you feel like you could really use those to help God and if you're in a good place with your relationship with God. If you're being held back for any reason, you might want to get rid of those, and you might want to start talking to people that, the people that brought you out, or people whom they trust and know the same things, just to better work on your relationship with God. Now, if there are some people that are holding you back, I'm sure that there are family and friends who are trying to call you back to what you were, and even for people who grew up in the church like me, there are people who are calling us to leave what we've grown up with and believe in what they believe. I've had atheists do it, I've had Mormons do it, I've had various other people do it. Um, that's something you should probably talk to a pastor about on handling that properly. You know, um, it depends on how hard they're trying and how militant they are. Militant's kind of a strong word, I know, but um, if you're dealing with someone like that, then you know what I mean. If they're just harping on you all the time and nothing you say is getting through, and it's it's um, it's not being healthy for you, and you know it's not being healthy for you, then you may very well want to just cut them out of your life. Tell them to leave you alone and get away from them. That's up to you, and that's between you and your pastor trying to figure that out. Um, I've had to do it a couple of times. I don't like it. It's hard. I do wonder if I could have done more, if I could have tried harder, if I could have said something different. Um, and I just pray for peace over those instances, knowing that God brought me through it and that I've done what I've done, and I just need to be at peace with it. So that's it for now. The next time, just so you know, we're going to go over, we're going to do some introductions to the works that David and Solomon did, as well as some other people. Um, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, also known as Song of Songs, sorry. And there's another name for it. It starts with a C. I think the Catholics use that name more often than not. I forget what it's called exactly. Um, Now, David and Solomon wrote a lot of the Psalms. Moses also wrote some of them, and there are various others that wrote some Psalms as well. So that's why I said as well as others. I also want to introduce you to the minor prophets. So there's going to be a lot of introductions next time, but then we're going to focus in on Daniel. And specifically probably chapter 3 and maybe 7 and 9. I'll have to look into that, and I'll put it in the description of the next event, which I'll try and post a little earlier than Monday or Tuesday, that we're doing it. I'll try and post at least a week in advance or something like that, and give you the specific chapters we're going to focus on, though I will talk about all of Daniel a little bit, at least to give you the story. And from there, there's probably only going to be one more meeting after that one on the Old Testament. And after that, we'll jump into the New Testament. So I wish you all the best. God bless. Again, if you have questions, just go to my website, brianediger.com, and click on the Contact Me page, or the Contact Us page, and you can email me through that. You can also join us on Facebook. If you go to the 21st Century Disciples page on my website, there's a link to the Facebook page, a link to the YouTube channel, which you're on right now, and also a link to the recent blog post page, which I'm trying to get a few more blogs up fairly soon. So God bless, and I will see you later.